When my daughter told me to find somewhere else to die because I was useless now, I did not collapse the way movies teach women my age to do. I did not clutch my chest or beg her to take the words back. I simply stood in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, watching the sunlight hit the counter I had wiped clean every morning for decades, and nodded. That single nod was the sound of 44 years of obedience clicking into place. 3 days later, I was sitting in a law office on Grant Avenue, staring at a stack of documents that proved my late husband had been playing the longest and quietest game of chess imaginable, and I was never meant to lose. If you are listening to this, stay with me, because I went from a homeless widow with nowhere to sleep to the woman holding every card on the table, and the people who thought I was disposable learned just how expensive that mistake could be. My name is Cheryl. I am 68 years old. I was married for 44 years, and I raised one daughter. For most of my life, I believed that love meant endurance, that loyalty meant silence, and that being a good wife and mother meant putting myself last without complaint. I was very good at disappearing inside other people's needs. I did not realize that disappearing was training the people closest to me to believe I had no value of my own. 2 months ago, I was still living in the house my husband and I bought when our daughter was 8 years old. When Thomas Bennett died suddenly of a heart attack at 72, my world did not shatter in a dramatic way. It went quiet. Too quiet. I moved through the days on autopilot, answering condolences, signing papers I barely read, and sleeping in the guest room because I could not bring myself to pack up the life we had shared. That was when my daughter, Natalie, arrived with concern polished to a shine. She spoke softly about my well-being, about safety, about how overwhelming such a large house must feel for someone like me. She said the stairs were dangerous, the memories unhealthy. I believed her, because mothers are conditioned to trust their children even when something deep inside whispers that something is wrong. Natalie had always been her father's pride. When she married Brian Collins, a corporate finance executive, and gave him grandchildren, Thomas could not stop talking about them. I faded quietly into the background, becoming the woman who cooked, cleaned, organized, hosted, and made sure everything functioned without ever needing recognition. After the funeral, concern turned into pressure. Brochures appeared on the dining table. Assisted living communities. Downsizing plans. Natalie and Brian spoke to me slowly, carefully, like I might break if given too much information. The final conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon. Natalie arrived unannounced with Brian and 2 large suitcases. She told me they had made a decision. They were moving in immediately. The house was perfect for their new life. When I said this was still my home, Natalie smiled and told me that according to her father's will, she owned everything now. Then she said it. Find somewhere else to die. You are useless now. I packed my life the way I had packed everything else for 44 years, carefully and without complaint. 2 suitcases. 1 small cardboard box of photographs. That was all I was allowed to take from a marriage that had lasted longer than most people's careers. Natalie stood in the bedroom doorway while I folded sweaters she had borrowed over the years and never returned. She checked her phone, sighed softly, and reminded me that Brian had a meeting to get to. I moved faster, not because she asked, but because I had been trained to anticipate inconvenience and erase it before it became a problem. When I carried my suitcases down the stairs for the last time, Natalie gestured toward the front door like a hotel clerk signaling checkout. She suggested a senior apartment complex on Willow Avenue, her voice bright, almost cheerful. Affordable, she said. Brian placed $200 in my hand with a tight smile, as if he were being generous. My daughter was inheriting more than $30 million, and she was worried about affordability. Kevin loaded my bags into their car without making eye contact. As we drove away, I watched the house disappear in the side mirror, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be erased. The motel sat between a shuttered diner and a tire shop. The sign flickered. The room smelled like disinfectant and old fabric. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the patterned carpet, trying to understand how a woman could raise a child, share a life, and still end up discarded like expired medication. That night, I did not sleep. I replayed Natalie's words again and again, each repetition stripping away another layer of denial. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, a thought I did not want took shape. Thomas had been many things, but he was not careless. He was meticulous to the point of obsession. Every document had a folder. Every folder had a label. He had shown me his will years ago, explaining it slowly, making sure I understood what he wanted and why. What Natalie described did not match the man I knew. The next morning, I used the motel's unstable wireless connection to search for Gerald Whitmore, the attorney who had handled Thomas's affairs for decades. His office was across town. The bus fare felt extravagant, but something told me this was not optional. When I arrived, his receptionist looked startled when I gave my name. Gerald himself seemed confused, then concerned, then alarmed in rapid succession. He told me there had been a formal reading of the will. Natalie told him I was too distraught to attend and had gone away to recover. The room seemed to tilt. When Gerald opened the file and began reading, my hands shook so badly I had to grip the chair. Thomas left me the house. He left me 70% of his assets, totaling approximately $22 million. Natalie was left $10 million in trust, with distributions contingent on one condition: her treatment of me after his death. Thomas had known. By throwing me out, by lying, by forging documents, Natalie had violated the trust. Gerald explained it plainly. Her inheritance reverted to me. All of it. I was not inheriting $22 million. I was inheriting $32 million in my home. Gerald used words I had never imagined applying to my child: elder abuse, fraud, felony. Within hours, banks were contacted. Accounts were frozen. Credit cards declined. Utilities suspended. Natalie called me screaming, accusing me of betrayal, confusion, ingratitude. I told her where I was. I told her the truth. She laughed, then went silent. That evening, Brian called to suggest a private resolution. I asked him directly if he had helped forge documents. He tried to justify it as protection. I told him the police would handle it. Natalie was arrested that night at a downtown restaurant while celebrating what she believed was her victory. Brian was arrested the next morning at his firm. I returned to my house alone. Natalie had already claimed the master bedroom, replacing Thomas's careful order with her chaos. I packed her belongings into garbage bags and left them on the porch. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in weeks. But peace did not come, because I was about to learn that betrayal was only the first layer of the truth. 3 days after Natalie's arrest, I heard the doorbell ring at precisely 9 in the morning. I did not need to look through the window to know who it was. Entitled people always arrive early, convinced that their time matters more than yours. When I opened the door, Brian's mother stood on my porch like she owned it. Eleanor Collins was impeccably dressed, her hair sculpted, her jewelry subtle but expensive. She looked at me the way people look at hired help who has stepped out of line. "Cheryl," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to discuss this situation rationally." She sat in my living room, crossing her legs, scanning the space as if assessing damages. She told me that Natalie had made mistakes, poor decisions under emotional stress. She told me Brian had simply followed his wife's lead. Then she offered money. $2 million in exchange for dropping charges. When I said no, she raised it to 5. She spoke calmly, as if we were negotiating the price of a used car, not the aftermath of multiple felonies. When I still refused, her tone shifted. She warned me that Thomas's business practices might not survive public scrutiny. The threat was polished, but unmistakable. After she left, I stood alone in my living room and realized something fundamental had changed. For the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid of disappointing anyone. That night, I went into Thomas's study. For decades, I had treated that room like sacred ground. His desk, his files, his order. I had respected his privacy because that was what supportive wives did. Now, privacy felt like another word for blindness. I opened drawers I had never opened before. I found folders labeled with names I did not recognize. Shell companies, consulting agreements, payments that did not align with any work I understood. By midnight, my hands were trembling. I called a private investigator recommended by Gerald. Her name was Rachel Moore, and she specialized in financial crimes. She arrived the next morning with a scanner and a practiced lack of surprise. She worked for hours, photographing documents, mapping transactions, tracing money flows. By the time she sat down across from me, her expression was grave. "Cheryl, your husband was running money through his consulting firm. This was not an accident or a bookkeeping error. This was a long-term laundering operation." The words felt unreal. Thomas had been stubborn, traditional, sometimes patronizing about money. But criminal never entered my imagination. Rachel showed me the patterns, the shell companies, the excessive fees, the timing that matched known criminal activity. Then she delivered the blow that made my vision blur. The $10 million Thomas left Natalie came from tainted funds. If federal authorities seized those assets, everything connected to them could be taken, including the house. That afternoon, Natalie called me from jail, her voice sharp with urgency. She told me Brian's attorneys had contacted federal investigators. They were offering cooperation, immunity for them, a deal for me, $5 million and the house. The rest surrendered to the government. She framed it as mercy. As protection, I recognized it for what it was: blackmail. That evening, I sat alone in Thomas's study, surrounded by evidence of a man I had never fully known. 44 years of marriage collapsed into spreadsheets and wire transfers. I thought about Eleanor's confidence, about Natalie's entitlement. They had known or suspected something. They believed fear would force my compliance. Instead, I called the authorities myself. Agent Melissa Grant met me at Gerald's office the next morning. She listened, without interrupting, as I laid out everything. The fraud, the forgeries, the attempted extortion. When I finished, she asked one question. Would you be willing to wear a recording device? I agreed. That night, Natalie and Brian arrived at my house, believing I was surrendering. Natalie hugged me too tightly. Brian carried a briefcase. They spoke openly, confident, relieved. They admitted to forging documents. They discussed immunity. They explained how they planned to walk away clean. Then federal agents entered my living room. Natalie screamed. Brian went pale. The briefcase was seized. Phones confiscated. As they were handcuffed, Brian warned me about dangerous people connected to Thomas's work. Agent Grant paused, looked at him, and added witness intimidation to his charges. After they were gone, she sat across from me and told me the truth. Thomas had been an informant. For 12 years, he worked with federal authorities to dismantle organized crime networks. The money was legitimate compensation. His cooperation had led to dozens of arrests and the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars. My inheritance was clean. Natalie and Brian had tried to blackmail me with information that actually proved Thomas's innocence. I sat there in silence, absorbing the final irony. My daughter believed she was smarter than me. She was wrong. And the consequences were just beginning. The morning after Natalie and Brian were taken away in handcuffs, my house felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, not calm, just hollow. The kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has happened. I walked from room to room, noticing details I had ignored for decades. The way the floor creaked near the staircase, the faded spot on the wall where Thomas once hung a painting I never liked but tolerated because he did. For the first time, I was not moving through the house as someone's wife or someone's mother. I was moving through it as its owner. Agent Grant called before noon. Natalie and Brian had been formally charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, and attempted extortion of a federal witness. Bail had been set high. Their accounts were frozen. Their professional reputations were already unraveling. Brian's firm had placed him on immediate suspension pending investigation. Natalie's carefully curated social circle was beginning to evaporate. That afternoon, reporters started calling. A story like this does not stay quiet for long. An elderly woman defrauded by her own child. Forged documents. Federal arrests. I ignored the calls at first. I had spent my life being spoken over. I was not ready to speak yet. 2 days later, Natalie's attorney contacted Gerald to request a meeting. He framed it as concern for family healing. I recognized the tactic immediately. Damage control. Gerald asked if I wanted to attend. I said no. I was done negotiating with people who only understood boundaries when enforced by law. Natalie wrote me a letter from jail. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. She apologized without taking responsibility. She blamed stress, fear, pressure. She told me she still loved me. I read it once and placed it back in the envelope. Love that destroys is not love. It is entitlement. A week later, Eleanor Collins returned. This time, she did not sit uninvited. She waited on the porch. The confidence was gone, replaced by calculation, sharpened by desperation. She offered another deal. Higher numbers. Better terms. She warned me again about exposure, about people Thomas had crossed. I listened politely, then told her the truth. Thomas had not crossed them. He had dismantled them. When Eleanor realized she had no leverage left, her expression hardened. She told me I was vindictive, that I was destroying families over money I would never understand how to manage. The words sounded painfully familiar. I thanked her for stopping by and closed the door. That night, I slept without medication for the first time since Thomas's death. The weeks that followed were consumed by legal proceedings. I sat for depositions. I answered questions from investigators. Each time I felt myself shedding another layer of the woman I had been. The one who apologized unnecessarily. The one who deferred instinctively. The one who believed being agreeable was the same as being safe. Natalie and Brian eventually accepted plea agreements. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, recorded conversations, financial trails that could not be explained away. When sentencing came, I attended. Natalie did not look at me. Brian did, once, briefly, with something that might have been regret, or might have been calculation. I did not try to interpret it. As they were led away, I felt no triumph. I felt closure. With the legal storm passing, I turned my attention inward. I hired contractors, not to erase Thomas, but to reclaim myself. His study became an art room. The walls were painted a color I loved but had never dared choose. I bought supplies and began painting again. Something I had abandoned in my 20s because it did not fit neatly into the life expected of me. I also made a decision about my inheritance. I did not need $30 million to live comfortably. What I needed was purpose. I established the Cheryl Bennett Foundation for Elder Justice, dedicating $15 million to legal aid, education, and advocacy for seniors facing financial abuse from family members. The work grounded me. Every case reminded me that my story was not rare. It was simply one that had been interrupted in time. The media interest returned when the foundation launched. I agreed to one interview, then another. I spoke carefully, not to shame Natalie, but to expose a pattern. I watched women my age sit straighter when they heard me speak. I watched them realize they were not foolish for trusting their children. They had been conditioned to. 6 months after the day I was told to find somewhere else to die, I stood alone in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, watching sunlight spill across a space that finally reflected me. I was not invisible anymore. I was not obedient. I was not disposable. I was finished being underestimated. 6 months after my daughter told me to find somewhere else to die, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for myself alone. The house was quiet in a different way now. Not hollow, not tense. Intentional. Sunlight poured through windows I had chosen, reflecting off countertops selected by my own hand. For the first time in 44 years, the space around me did not exist to support someone else's comfort. It existed to support mine. Natalie and Brian were both serving federal sentences. I did not attend every hearing. I did not read every update. I learned early on that closure does not come from watching people suffer. It comes from refusing to let their choices define your future. Natalie wrote letters from prison, 17 of them. I read the first few before I realized something important. Every apology centered on her pain, her fear, her consequences. None of them centered on what she had done to me. I stopped responding. People often ask if that makes me cold. I disagree. It makes me honest. With the legal proceedings finished, I turned my attention to building something that would outlive anger. I established the Cheryl Bennett Foundation for Elder Justice, committing $15 million to legal aid, education, and advocacy for seniors facing financial abuse by family members. I met women who had been tricked, threatened, manipulated, and erased by the very people who claimed to love them. When they heard my story, they did not cry. They straightened. Recognition does that. The media attention was unexpected. Interviews, panels, a documentary offer I eventually accepted on one condition. The story would not be about revenge. It would be about awareness. Silence is what allows this kind of abuse to survive. I was done being silent. Natalie's attorney requested a meeting to discuss reconciliation. I declined. Forgiveness is not a prerequisite for healing. Accountability is. Family is not defined by shared DNA. It is defined by who protects you when you are vulnerable. Natalie failed that test long before she committed fraud. She failed it when she decided my life had an expiration date. I began painting again. I had abandoned it in my 20s when practicality took priority over joy. In my new studio, I painted a woman standing in sunlight, her face turned forward, her posture unafraid. She did not look like a victim. She looked like someone who had learned a hard truth and survived it. Sometimes, late in the evening, I think about the woman I was 6 months ago. The one who packed her life into 2 suitcases and accepted humiliation because she believed endurance was love. I wish I could tell her this. Compliance does not earn respect. Silence does not guarantee safety. And being agreeable does not make you valued. What saved me was not money. It was clarity. If someone in your life has made you feel small, disposable, or inconvenient, understand this. The most dangerous moment for people who underestimate you is the moment you stop needing their approval. I was never useless. I was simply underestimated, and that mistake cost them everything.